Between them, they controlled more land, more gold, and more soldiers than any force in the known world. The Eastern Roman Empire sat on centuries of accumulated power, its capital Constantinople gleaming behind walls so thick and so tall that no army had ever breached them. The Western Roman Empire, older and more scarred, still commanded the loyalty of millions from the British Isles to the edge of the Sahara. Together, they were not just dominant, they were supposed to be permanent. They were supposed to be eternal. And then, out of the frozen steppes of Central Asia, came one man who made both of them beg. His name was Attila. And the moment you think you understand him, you are already wrong. He was not the mindless savage that Roman scribes painted him as. They had every reason to lie. He was not the romantic warrior king that later European legends tried to make him. They had every reason to mythologize. He was something far more dangerous than either of those comfortable stories. He was a man who understood power at a molecular level, who had studied his enemies from the inside, and who spent his entire life turning their assumptions about him into weapons. The Romans thought they knew what he was. He let them think that. It was the last mistake many of them ever made. Picture the world of the 400s. The Eastern Empire is wealthier, but paralyzed by court intrigue, so suffocating that military decisions take months to reach the men who need to make them in hours. Two enormous creaking machines, both convinced of their own invincibility, both hemorrhaging from wounds they refuse to acknowledge. And somewhere on the Hungarian plain, a man is watching all of this and thinking. What a controlled storm. He understood something that neither Rome nor Constantinople was willing to admit, that fear, applied with surgical precision, is worth more than 1,000 soldiers. He never had to destroy a city to make the next city surrender. He only had to destroy one and then let the survivors run. The stories did the rest. By the time his horsemen appeared on the horizon, the psychological war was already over. What followed was just paperwork. He turned terror into tribute, chaos into leverage, and his own terrifying reputation into the most effective diplomatic tool of the ancient world. Here is what no one tells you about Attila the Hun. He almost won. Not almost in the romantic, poetic sense, almost in the cold, historical, mathematical sense. There was a moment, a specific afternoon in a specific year, when the fate of European civilization genuinely hung on decisions being made by exhausted, frightened men in rooms that smelled like blood and smoke. The world you live in, the languages spoken around you, the borders drawn on every map, the civilization that produced everything from the chair you were sitting in to the words you are reading right now, nearly turned out completely different. This is the story of how close it came, and of the man who almost pulled it off. There is a letter sitting in the historical record that most people have never read. It was written by a Roman emperor, not a general, not a governor, not some minor official scrambling to save his own skin. An emperor, the most powerful man in the civilized Western world, the heir to centuries of Roman authority. And in this letter, he is begging. He is offering gold. He is offering land. He is offering his own dignity on a silver platter. He is begging a man who lived in a wooden hall on the Hungarian plain, who wore no crown, who commanded no navy, who had never once in his life set foot inside a marble palace, to please stop. That man had a name, and the name alone was enough to empty cities. Here is the thing that no textbook ever quite captures about Attila the Hun. The terror he inspired was not accidental. It was not a side effect of his campaigns. It was the campaign. Before his horsemen ever appeared on the horizon of a Roman province, the psychological machinery was already running at full speed. Refugees were moving. Rumors were mutating into nightmares. Governors were writing desperate letters and making promises they had no authority to keep. By the time Attila actually arrived somewhere, the real battle was already over. What followed was just the collection of the debt. This is the detail that changes everything about how you understand this man. And it is the detail that most historians bury under logistics and battle dates. But here is the question I want you to hold in your head right now. The one we are going to spend a serious amount of time unpacking. How does a man who never built a city, never established a legal code, never minted a currency, and never left behind a single written word of his own, bring two separate empires to the edge of collapse? Not one, two, simultaneously. The Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Two massive, entrenched, ancient political machines with professional armies, fortified borders, and centuries of institutional knowledge, both neutralized by a single human being operating out of what was essentially a large tent city in Central Europe. That is not a military story. That is a psychology story, and it is one of the most ruthless and sophisticated ones ever told. Let us establish something right now, because the mythology around this man has been so thoroughly distorted, both by his enemies and by his later admirers, that you almost have to sandblast through the nonsense before you can get to the actual person underneath. The Romans called him the scourge of God. That phrase was not a compliment they reluctantly handed out. It was a theological explanation they invented because the alternative was too humiliating to admit. The alternative being, we, the heirs of Augustus and Trajan and Constantine, we who built the aqueducts and the Colosseum and the legal foundations of Western civilization, got completely and systematically outmaneuvered by a man we spent decades dismissing as a barbarian. The scourge of God was easier to live with. It meant it was not really their fault. God was just punishing them. It was a story Romans told themselves so they could sleep at night. The reality was considerably more uncomfortable. Attila was not a force of. He was not divine punishment wearing human skin. He was a strategist of the first order who had spent years studying the exact mechanisms by which Roman power operated, its diplomatic pressure points, its financial vulnerabilities, its bureaucratic paralysis, its habit of paying enemies to go away rather than fighting them. He knew all of this, not from the outside looking in, but because, as a young man, he had lived inside the Roman system as a political hostage. He had eaten Roman food, learned Latin, watched Roman senators negotiate, observed Roman generals plan, and absorbed everything like a document he would spend the rest of his life citing against its authors. The Romans taught him exactly how to destroy them. Then they sent him home and acted surprised when he did. Now think about the world he came back to. The year is somewhere around 430 of the Common Era. The Western Empire is a machine that has been running on fumes for decades, propped up by the military genius of a single general named Aetius, a man we will come back to, because the relationship between Aetius and Attila is one of the strangest and most consequential friendships in the ancient world. The Eastern Empire is wealthier and more stable, but its wealth has become its weakness. It has learned to buy peace rather than fight for it, and Attila has learned to read that habit like a menu. To the north and west, the Hunnic Confederation is expanding its reach, absorbing Germanic tribes not just by conquest, but by a complex system of loyalty, tribute, and terror that functions more like a protection racket than a traditional empire. Pay and survive, resist, and become the example that convinces everyone else to pay. It worked with extraordinary efficiency. Here is what I find genuinely staggering about this moment in history, and I need you to really sit with this. Attila did not have a bureaucracy. He did not have a central treasury managed by trained administrators. He did not have a standing army in the modern sense, with ranks and salaries and logistics departments. What he had was himself, his reputation, his intelligence, his absolute refusal to be predictable, and his talent for making every potential enemy feel that the cost of resistance was higher than the cost of submission. He ran what was arguably the most powerful political entity in the known world on willpower and psychological leverage. That is either the most impressive thing you have ever heard or the most terrifying. Possibly both. And here is the loop I want to leave open right now, the thread we are going to pull on through everything that follows. There is a moment in Attila's story, a specific decision he makes at what should be the absolute peak of his power that has never been fully explained. He is standing at the gates of Italy. Rome is sitting there, defenseless, the most symbolically important city in the world, the city whose name is synonymous with civilization itself. Every military calculation in existence says, take it, destroy it, make it the example that echoes for 1,000 years. And he does not. He turns around and goes home. Historians have been arguing about why for 15 centuries. The official explanations, plague, supply shortages, a meeting with the Pope, are all real factors, but none of them fully close the question. Because Attila was not a man who was easily stopped by logistics. Something else was happening in that decision. And when we get there, I think the answer tells us more about who Attila really was than any battle he ever fought. But we are not there yet. Before we can understand the man who made emperors beg, we need to understand the world that made him. We need to walk into the steppe, feel the cold, understand what it meant to be born into a society that had no word for weakness, because weakness was simply another word for dead. We need to understand what Attila grew up inside. And then we need to understand what happened when that upbringing collided with the most sophisticated civilization on Earth. Because that collision is where the real story starts. And it starts earlier and stranger than almost anyone realizes. Forget everything you think you know about the Huns. Forget the images of screaming horsemen pouring over hills like a natural disaster with hooves. Forget the Roman caricatures, the flat noses, the scarred faces, the descriptions of men who were barely human, who slept on horseback and ate raw meat and had no concept of civilization. Those descriptions were written by people who needed their audience to believe that losing to the Huns was not really losing to people. It was losing to something else, something monstrous, something that could not be reasoned with or understood. Because if the Huns were understandable, if they were just men with a different strategy, then Rome had no excuse. So Rome made them into monsters, and for 15 centuries, we largely believed it. The reality of Hunnic society was brutal, yes, but it was brutal in the way that all survival-based cultures are brutal, with a ruthless internal logic that made complete sense given the environment that produced it. The Eurasian steppe is not a forgiving landscape. It is vast, cold, unpredictable, and almost entirely devoid of the fixed resources that allow sedentary civilizations to accumulate wealth and build walls. You cannot farm the steppe the way you farm the Po Valley. You cannot store grain in a city if you have no city. What you can do, what the Huns did with extraordinary sophistication, is move. Constant, strategic, seasonally calibrated movement across thousands of kilometers, following grass and water, managing herds of horses that were simultaneously their transportation, their food supply, their military asset, and their measure of wealth. The horse was not a tool to the Huns. It was the entire economy. Attila was born into this world somewhere around the year 390 of the Common Era, though the exact date is one of the many things history has swallowed without returning. What we know is the family he was born into, the Amal dynasty, the ruling clan of the Hunnic Confederation, a bloodline that carried both privilege and danger in equal measure. His father was Munzuk, brother to the Hunnic kings Oktar and Ruga, which meant that Attila grew up in proximity to absolute power without actually holding it. A position that tends to produce one of two things in a person: comfortable mediocrity or obsessive ambition. The man Attila became makes very clear which category he fell into. From the beginning, he was watching, calculating, storing information the way his people stored dried meat, methodically, against future need. Hunnic boys learned to ride before they learned to walk with any confidence. This is not a metaphor. Archaeologists examining Hunnic skeletal remains have found bone deformations consistent with a lifetime on horseback beginning in early childhood, bodies physically reshaped by the demands of the culture. Archery from horseback was not a skill, it was a language. The composite bow the Huns used, a recurved, layered weapon made from bone and sinew and wood, requiring years to manufacture and years more to master, could punch through Roman armor at distances that Roman archers could not even reach. When Hunnic cavalry fired at full gallop, turning backwards in the saddle to shoot at pursuers, it was not a trick. It was the standard vocabulary of their warfare. The Romans had a word for it. They called it the Parthian shot, borrowed from another horse people who had terrified them centuries earlier. They never quite figured out how to stop it. But here is where Attila's story diverges from every other Hunnic warrior who ever lived. And this is the pivot point that most accounts blow past without stopping. As a young man, Attila was sent to live in Rome. Not as a conqueror, not as a raider, as a hostage. This was standard diplomatic practice for the era. Powerful entities exchanged high-born children as living guarantees of treaty compliance. The Huns held Roman boys in their camps. Rome held Hunnic boys in theirs. The arrangement was supposed to be mutually civilizing, a form of enforced cultural exchange wrapped in a velvet threat. If your people break the treaty, something unfortunate happens to your child. It was diplomacy with teeth. And in theory, the hostage children would grow up bicultural, forming relationships that would smooth future negotiations. In practice, it produced something Rome did not anticipate: a Hunnic prince who understood Rome better than most Romans did. Think about what that means for a moment. Young Attila, sharp, observant, growing up in a culture that treated information as survival, is dropped into the heart of the late Roman imperial system. He watches the Senate. He watches the court. He watches the generals argue with the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats undermine the generals, and the emperors rotate in and out with alarming frequency, each one leaving the system slightly more hollow than the last. He sees the gap between Roman self-image and Roman reality, the enormous, yawning chasm between what Rome said it was and what it actually was by the early 500s. He sees which pressure points produce panic. He sees how much of Roman power is performance, is tradition, is the accumulated momentum of a reputation that the actual machinery of the empire can no longer fully support. He is being given a masterclass in the vulnerabilities of the most powerful civilization on Earth, and he is taking notes with everything except a pen. At the same time, a Roman boy named Aetius was living among the Huns. And this detail matters enormously, because Aetius would grow up to become the greatest Roman general of his age, the man they called the last of the Romans, the one individual holding the crumbling Western Empire together through a combination of military genius and political cunning. Aetius and Attila almost certainly knew each other as boys. They grew up in each other's worlds. They learned each other's languages, each other's customs, each other's ways of thinking about war and power and loyalty. Decades later, they would face each other across the bloodiest battlefield of the 5th century. But before that day came, they were something stranger and more complicated. They were almost friends. Or at least, they were the closest thing to friends that two men shaped entirely by power and survival could manage to be. When Attila returned to the steppe, he returned transformed. Not Romanized. That would be the wrong word, and it would miss the point entirely. He returned with a dual vision that almost no one in the ancient world possessed. He could see the steppe the way a Hun saw it, as a fluid, mobile world where power was measured in horses and speed and the willingness to move faster than your enemies could respond. And he could see Rome the way a Roman saw it, as a system of fixed institutions, fixed borders, fixed hierarchies, and fixed assumptions about how the world worked and who was allowed to threaten it. The collision of those two visions inside one skull produced something unprecedented. It produced a man who could fight like a Hun and think like a Roman, who could terrorize like a force of, and negotiate like a senator, who understood that the most effective weapon against any system is a thorough knowledge of where its foundations are cracked. He came home to a Hunnic confederation that was powerful but not yet unified under a single dominant will. His uncles, Oktar and Ruga, were capable leaders who had already begun extracting tribute from the Eastern Roman Empire, a fact that tells you everything about the trajectory this story was already on before Attila even took power. The machine was running. The direction was set. What Attila would bring was not a new destination but a terrifying acceleration, a ruthlessness of execution and a sophistication of strategy that turned a dangerous confederation into something the ancient world had never quite seen before. But first, he had to get to the throne, and getting there required removing one very significant obstacle. His brother was standing in the way. In the year 434 of the Common Era, the king of the Huns died. Ruga, the man who had built the confederation into a force that already had the Eastern Roman Empire paying tribute just to be left alone, was gone. And just like that, the most dangerous throne in the known world was empty. What happened next is recorded with the kind of clinical brevity that historians use when they are not entirely sure what the truth is. Attila and his brother Bleda jointly inherited the kingdom. Two brothers, one empire. An arrangement that sounded on the surface like stability. It was not stability. It was a countdown. Joint rulership among the Huns was not unprecedented. Their uncles, Oktar and Ruga, had managed it, more or less, for years. But those were different men in a different moment. Attila was not a man built for the word joint. Everything we know about him, from Roman diplomatic accounts, from the Chronicle of Priscus, who actually sat at his table and watched him operate, from the pattern of every single decision he made across his entire career, points to a psychology that was constitutionally incapable of sharing power in any meaningful sense. He could delegate, He could reward loyalty with extraordinary generosity. He could build coalitions of terrifying complexity. But at the center of every arrangement, there was always one will: his. The idea of a co-equal partner, especially one connected to him by blood and therefore by legitimate rival claim, was not something Attila's architecture of power had room for. It was a structural problem. And Attila solved structural problems. Bleda is one of history's great shadows. We know almost nothing about him as an individual, his personality, his ambitions, his relationship with his brother beyond the bare fact of their shared rule. Roman sources mention him in passing, usually as the less interesting half of a diplomatic equation. He attended negotiations. He was present at the famous meeting of 435, where the brothers forced the Eastern Roman Empire to sign the Treaty of Margus, a humiliating document that doubled the annual tribute Rome paid to the Huns and forced the Romans to return Hunnic refugees and defectors at Attila's demand. Bleda was there for that. He existed. He ruled. And then, in 445, he did not. The sources are almost uniformly terse on the subject. Bleda died. Attila became sole ruler. End of entry. Move on. But here is what the terseness is hiding. Bleda did not die of old age. He did not die in battle. The most persistent account, the one that serious historians do not dismiss even if they cannot fully confirm it, is that Attila killed him. Murdered his own brother. Removed the one person whose existence represented the only legitimate internal check on his absolute authority. And the reason the sources are so careful and so vague about this is partly because some of them were writing under Attila's shadow. You did not produce a detailed accusatory account of a man who could send 10,000 horsemen to your doorstep, and partly because the Romans themselves were not entirely sure what had happened. They knew Bleda was there, and then he was not. They knew Attila was now alone on the throne. The arithmetic was uncomfortable, but the evidence was circumstantial. So history recorded the result and left the method deliberately blurry. Now ask yourself what this moment tells us about Attila, because this is one of those details that historians mention and then hurry past, but that actually unlocks something essential about the man. Fratricide, the killing of a sibling for power, was not unheard of in the ancient world. Roman imperial history is practically carpeted with it. But there is a difference between fratricide as a desperate act of political survival and fratricide as a calculated, strategic decision made from a position of already considerable strength. By 445, Attila was not a weak man scrambling to survive. He was already the most feared ruler in Europe. He did not need to kill Bleda to stay alive. He did it because he had decided, with the cold clarity that characterized every major move of his career, that the Hunnic empire he intended to build could not afford the structural weakness of divided authority. He was not eliminating a threat. He was optimizing a system. That distinction matters, and it should make you deeply uncomfortable. What followed the removal of Bleda was immediate and unmistakable. Attila moved with a speed and decisiveness that suggests he had been planning this consolidation for some time, not necessarily the specific act of killing his brother, but the strategic posture he intended to adopt the moment he was sole ruler. Within months, he launched the campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire that would define the first phase of his dominance. The Balkans burned. Nisus, a major Roman city, the birthplace of the Emperor Constantine himself, was destroyed so thoroughly that when Roman ambassadors passed through the area years later, they reported that the plains outside the ruins were still white with bones. That was not collateral damage. That was a message delivered at city scale to every other settlement within 500 kilometers. This is what non-compliance looks like. This is your alternative to tribute. Priscus of Panium is the source we keep returning to for this period, and for good reason. He was actually there. In 448, he traveled with a Roman diplomatic mission to Attila's court, and he left behind a account that is extraordinary in its detail and its honesty. He describes the physical appearance of Attila: short, with a broad chest, a large head, small eyes, a thin beard streaked with grey, a flat nose, and a dark complexion. Not the towering warrior of legend. A compact, contained man, whose physical presence communicated nothing obviously threatening, and yet whose effect on every room he entered was immediate and total. Priscus describes watching Attila at a feast, seated on a plain wooden chair, while his subordinates drank from gold and silver cups, eating from a simple wooden plate, while his guests were served on precious metal. The contrast was deliberate. It was theatre. He was performing his own indifference to the wealth he commanded, and the performance was devastating in its effectiveness. But the detail from Priscus that stays with me, the one I keep coming back to, is something he observed about how Attila moved through his own court. There was no performance of power in the theatrical Roman sense. No elaborate ritual, no procession, no carefully staged ceremony designed to remind observers of their own smallness. Attila simply walked into a room, and the room changed. His subordinates watched him the way you watch something that might be dangerous, with that particular quality of attention that is not quite reverence and not quite fear, but exists in the tense space between them. He had not built that atmosphere through cruelty alone. Cruelty without competence produces resentment, and his men did not resent him. He had built it through a combination of absolute decisiveness, demonstrated strategic genius, and the specific kind of personal loyalty that comes from following someone who always seems to know something you do not. The consolidation of soul power changed Attila in one visible way. It removed the last theoretical brake on his ambition. With Bleda alive, there was always the question of consensus, of competing claims, of the diplomatic friction that comes from dual authority. With Bleda gone, there was only Attila's judgment, Attila's timeline, Attila's vision of what the Hunnic Empire should become. And that vision, it turned out, was considerably larger than anything the Romans had calculated for. They had been managing him as a regional problem. Expensive, yes. Humiliating, yes. But containable. They were about to discover that they had fundamentally misread the scale of what they were dealing with. The tribute they had been paying was not satisfying his appetite. It had been teaching him what they were willing to pay. And now, he was ready to find out what they were willing to lose. Constantinople was supposed to be untouchable. This was not arrogance, it was engineering. The city sat on a narrow peninsula flanked by water on three sides, protected on its landward edge by the Theodosian walls, a triple layer of fortifications so massive, so meticulously designed that they would not be breached for another 1,000 years after Attila's lifetime. The Eastern Roman Empire had poured its most sophisticated military thinking into making its capital a problem that could not be solved by brute force. And they were right. Attila never took Constantinople. But here is what is so extraordinary about what he did instead. He did not need to. He found something more efficient than siege warfare. He found the gap between what Constantinople could defend and what Constantinople could afford to lose. And he drove a wagon through it. The Eastern Roman Empire of the 400s was wealthy in the way that old institutions are wealthy, deeply, structurally, almost unconsciously rich, with revenue streams and administrative systems that had been accumulating for centuries. But wealth and financial flexibility are not the same thing, and Attila understood that distinction with the precision of someone who had studied the system from the inside. The Eastern court under Emperor Theodosius II had developed a particular habit: paying. When a threat appeared on the frontier, the calculation was almost always the same. Could the army handle it? Possibly. Would a payment handle it more cheaply and more certainly? Almost always, yes. This was not cowardice. It was rational resource management in an empire that had 100 frontiers and never quite enough soldiers for all of them simultaneously. It was also, from Attila's perspective, an absolutely perfect vulnerability to exploit. The tribute arrangement that Attila and Bleda had extracted from Constantinople at the Treaty of Margus in 435 was already extraordinary by the standards of the time. The Eastern Empire was paying £350 of gold per year, not as a one-time payment, not as a war indemnity, but as an ongoing annual tribute, a permanent acknowledgement that the Huns were a power that needed to be managed rather than defeated. That number alone should reframe how you think about the balance of power in this period. Rome was paying protection money to a man on the steppe, and the payment was working, in the sense that Attila was not burning everything in sight, which meant the Eastern court could tell itself that the policy was successful. What they did not fully appreciate was that every payment was also a data point. Attila was learning the upper limit of what they would pay before they would fight, and he had not found it yet. Then Constantinople made a mistake. The details are almost petty in their specificity, which makes them somehow more infuriating. The Eastern Romans violated the Treaty of Margus. They harbored Hunnic refugees who had fled across the border, exactly the kind of defectors Attila had explicitly demanded be returned. They allegedly plundered Hunnic graves near the frontier, which in Hunnic culture was an act of desecration serious enough to constitute a declaration of war. Whether these violations were deliberate provocations, bureaucratic negligence, or genuine misunderstandings does not particularly matter. What matters is that Attila had his justification, and justification was all he had ever needed to do what he already intended to do anyway. In 441, he moved. What followed across the next several years was not a single campaign, but a sustained, methodical demolition of Roman military and economic capacity in the Balkans. Attila did not chase the Roman army. He made the Roman army chase him, which is a fundamentally different strategic posture that gave him permanent initiative. He would strike a city, strip it of everything valuable, destroy its capacity to function as a military or administrative base, and move before the Roman response could arrive. Then he would hit somewhere else. The Roman forces were constantly reacting, constantly arriving at smoking ruins, constantly receiving news of the next disaster before they had finished processing the last one. It was asymmetric warfare, conducted at a scale and speed that Roman military doctrine, built around fortified positions and supply chain logistics, had no effective answer for. The cities that fell in this period read like a map of Roman civilization in the Balkans being systematically erased. Viminacium, Singidunum, Sirmium, Nisus, which we have already mentioned, but which deserves a moment of specific attention because of what Nisus represented. This was not a frontier outpost. This was a major imperial city, the birthplace of Constantine the Great, the man who had made Christianity the religion of the Roman Empire and built Constantinople itself. Destroying Nisus was not just a military act. It was a symbolic statement of such enormous audacity that it must have landed in Constantinople like a physical blow. Attila was not raiding the edges of the empire. He was erasing its landmarks. He was demonstrating that nothing the Romans considered sacred or permanent was beyond his reach. And through all of this, the Eastern Court's response was a masterclass in institutional paralysis. Emperor Theodosius II was not a stupid man, but he was a weak one. A scholar and a theologian, more comfortable in his library than in a war council, surrounded by advisors whose primary skill was court politics rather than military strategy. The Eastern Army did fight. There were engagements, multiple of them, and in nearly every one, the Hunnic forces either won outright or withdrew on their own terms before a decisive result could be forced. The Roman generals were competent. They were simply operating in a framework, fixed bases, slow logistics, defensive doctrine, that Attila had specifically designed his campaigns to render ineffective. You cannot win a foot race against someone who rewrote the rules of running. By 447, Attila launched what historians consider his most devastating campaign against the Eastern Empire, pushing deep into the Balkans, reportedly destroying over 70 settlements and advancing to within a few days' march of Constantinople itself. The walls held, they always held, but the devastation of the surrounding territory was catastrophic. The Eastern Empire's Balkan provinces, which provided significant tax revenue and military manpower, were functionally destroyed as productive regions. Fields were burned, populations were killed or enslaved or scattered. The infrastructure of Roman administration in an entire section of the empire was simply gone. And when the dust settled, Constantinople did what Constantinople always did. It negotiated. It paid. The Treaty of Anatolius in 448 was the moment the ledger became truly obscene. The annual tribute was raised to 2,100 pounds of gold per year, 6 times the already humiliating amount established at Margus. There was a massive back payment demanded for the years of supposed treaty violations, and the territorial concessions along the Danube frontier effectively created a buffer zone of Roman land that Rome could no longer use, but Attila could. If you were keeping track, the Eastern Roman Empire, the wealthiest political entity in the Western world, was now paying the equivalent of a small country's entire annual output to a man who lived in a wooden hall and ate from a wooden plate. The reversal is so complete it almost seems impossible. But here is what makes it even more remarkable. Attila was not done. He had spent years extracting everything the Eastern Empire would give him. Now he turned his attention west, and the reasons why, the specific trigger that aimed him at the Western Empire like a weapon, involve a Roman princess, a golden ring, and a letter so reckless it may be the most consequential piece of correspondence in the history of the ancient world. Her name was Honoria. She was the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, which made her one of the most politically valuable women in the known world, and one of the most miserable. Imperial princesses in the 5th century existed in a very specific kind of gilded cage, too important to be allowed a private life, too dangerous to be permitted real power, permanently available as a diplomatic chess piece to be moved according to someone else's calculation. Honoria had watched her brother consolidate his hold on the Western throne while she was kept in careful, comfortable, suffocating irrelevance. And then, at some point, around 450, she did something so reckless, so operatically self-destructive, so perfectly timed to change the course of Western history that historians still argue about whether she fully understood what she was doing. She sent Attila a ring and a letter. The letter, as best as anyone can reconstruct it, was essentially a marriage proposal. Let that land for a moment. A Roman imperial princess, sister of the reigning emperor of the West, contacted the most feared man alive and invited him into her family. The reasons vary depending on which source you consult. Some say she was trying to escape an arranged marriage to a safe, politically convenient Roman senator she despised. Some say she genuinely believed Attila could give her the power and freedom the Roman court denied her. Some say she was simply desperate and made a catastrophic decision in a moment of desperation. Whatever the internal logic, the external consequence was immediate and enormous. Attila looked at that ring, looked at that letter, and saw something that had nothing to do with romance. He saw a legal claim. He declared that Honoria was his betrothed, and he demanded, as her dowry, half of the Western Roman Empire. Valentinian's response was fury, followed by panic, followed by the kind of frantic diplomatic scrambling that characterizes a court that knows it has no good options. He wanted to execute Honoria. His mother, the formidable Galla Placidia, talked him out of it. Executing the woman would remove Attila's stated justification for war, but also confirm that the Romans took the claim seriously enough to be afraid of it. Instead, Valentinian hastily married Honoria off to that safe Roman senator, declared her engagement to Attila null and void, on the grounds that Roman women could not contract marriages without their male guardian's consent, and sent back increasingly firm diplomatic messages explaining that the Western Empire would not be recognizing any claim arising from a letter his sister had no authority to send. Attila found all of this completely unpersuasive. He had his justification. He was already moving. But here is the layer of this story that makes it genuinely complicated rather than just spectacular. Attila's invasion of the West was not purely about Honoria. It was not even primarily about Honoria. The princess and her ring were the match. The powder was a decade of accumulated strategic logic. The Western Empire's Visigothic allies in Gaul, the large, powerful Germanic kingdom that had settled in what is now southwestern France, were a military asset that Rome depended on. Attila had been cultivating relationships with Germanic groups who were rivals of the Visigoths, building a coalition argument that his campaign in Gaul was actually aimed at the Visigoths and not at Rome itself. He told the Romans he was their ally against the Visigoths. He told the Visigoths' rivals he was their champion. He told everyone what they needed to hear to delay their response until he was already inside Gaul with an army so large that the sources describe it in numbers that, even accounting for ancient exaggeration, are staggering. This was not a raid. This was a full-scale invasion designed to reshape the political geography of Europe. Standing between Attila and the destruction of the Western Empire was one man, Flavius Aetius, the last of the Romans, as his contemporaries called him. The general who had spent his career performing the impossible task of holding a disintegrating empire together through military genius, political cunning, and a network of alliances so complex that he seemed to be the only person who fully understood it. And Aetius had a specific advantage that no other Roman commander possessed. He knew Attila personally. He had lived among the Huns as a young hostage in the same years that Attila had lived among the Romans. He understood how Attila thought, how he moved, what he feared, and what he did not. If anyone could find the seam in Attila's strategy, it was this man. But finding the seam required something Aetius did not yet have: an army large enough to contest the field. What Aetius did in the spring of 451 was arguably the most impressive diplomatic achievement of the entire 5th century. He convinced the Visigoths to fight alongside Rome. Think about what that required. The Visigoths were a Germanic people who had sacked Rome itself in 410. They were not exactly reliable allies with a warm history of Roman cooperation. Their king, Theodoric I, had every reason to be suspicious of Roman intentions, and every incentive to wait and see how the battle played out before committing. Aetius persuaded him anyway. He built, essentially from scratch, a coalition army of Romans, Visigoths, Alans, Burgundians, and various other Germanic groups, united by the single shared interest of not being destroyed by the man currently burning his way through Gaul. It was the political equivalent of getting every competing gang in a city to agree to fight one external threat together. It should not have worked. It worked. The two armies met in June of 451 on the Catalonian plains, somewhere in what is now the Champagne region of northeastern France. The battle that followed was, by every account that survives, one of the largest and most brutal engagements of the ancient world. The sources describe rivers running with blood, which is the kind of language ancient writers use when they want to convey that the killing was so extensive it defeated their ability to describe it precisely. Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths, was killed in the fighting, struck down in the chaos, his body found only after the battle ended. The Hunnic forces were pushed back, something that had happened so rarely in Attila's military career that the moment itself carries enormous weight. By nightfall, Attila had withdrawn his forces to a defensive position within a ring of wagons and was reportedly preparing to die rather than be captured. A detail that tells you how seriously he assessed the situation. And then Aetius made a decision that has puzzled military historians ever since. He did not press the attack. With Attila trapped, his forces depleted and on the defensive, the coalition army holding the initiative for the first time in the entire campaign, Aetius called off the pursuit. He let the Visigoth forces withdraw to attend to the burial of their king. He allowed the night to pass without a final assault. And in the morning, Attila was still there, still dangerous, and Aetius chose to let him leave rather than force a final reckoning. The debate about why has never fully settled. The most common argument is that Aetius needed Attila as a counterweight, that destroying the Huns completely would leave the Visigoths as the dominant power in the West, which would create a different but equally serious problem for Roman authority. He was managing the balance of power rather than winning the war.
It was the calculation of a politician wearing a general's armor, and depending on your perspective, it was either the most sophisticated strategic thinking of the era or the single most consequential mistake of the 5th century. Because Attila left the Catalonian plains alive, and a living Attila was never finished. In the spring of 452, Attila crossed the Alps. This sentence should stop you cold, because crossing the Alps with a large army in the 5th century was not a logistical footnote. It was an almost incomprehensible undertaking. The passes were narrow, brutal, and treacherous. Supply lines stretched to the point of absurdity. Every military planner in the ancient world understood that the Alps were not just a mountain range, but a strategic wall, a natural fortress that had protected the Italian peninsula for centuries. Hannibal had crossed them, famously, catastrophically, and the memory of that feat had become legendary precisely because it was so extraordinary. Now, Attila crossed them, and on the other side, Italy sat waiting, nearly defenseless, its armies depleted after the campaign in Gaul, its emperor, Valentinian III, having already fled Rome for the relative safety of Ravenna. The most symbolic city in the world was undefended, and Attila walked toward it. The first major obstacle he encountered was not a Roman army, it was a city called Aquileia, one of the most important urban centers in northern Italy, a major port and commercial hub sitting at the top of the Adriatic. Aquileia had walls. It had a garrison. It had the will to resist, which was becoming an increasingly rare commodity in a Western empire that had watched Attila's reputation precede him for a decade. The siege lasted months, far longer than Attila's typical operational tempo, which relied on speed and psychological shock rather than grinding attrition. There are accounts, almost certainly legendary in their specifics, but probably accurate in their general outline, of Attila watching a flock of storks abandoning their nests on the city walls and interpreting it as an omen that the city was about to fall. He ordered a final assault. Aquileia was taken, sacked so thoroughly that it effectively ceased to exist as a major city, and the message ricocheted across northern Italy at the speed of terror. Attila was through. He was real, and he was moving south. What followed was a procession of capitulations that reads like a map of Italian civilization being handed over in sequence. Milan fell. Pavia fell. City after city either surrendered before Attila arrived or emptied itself of population as the refugees streamed south ahead of the Hunnic advance. The Po Valley, the agricultural heartland of Roman Italy, the region that fed the peninsula, was being systematically stripped. And through all of this, Valentinian III sat in Ravenna, writing desperate letters and making promises he could not keep.
while the man who was supposed to solve this problem, Aetius, appears in the sources of this period as curiously, almost suspiciously, passive. The general who had stopped Attila at the Catalonian plains the year before seemed to have no answer for this new campaign. Or perhaps, as some historians have suggested, he was calculating something more complicated than simple military response.
And then Attila stopped. He did not stop because a Roman army blocked his path. There was no army capable of doing that. He did not stop because his forces had been defeated or significantly damaged. He stopped somewhere in northern Italy, turned his army around, and went back across the Alps. Rome was still standing. Attila had been within striking distance of the most symbolically important target in the Western world, the city whose name was synonymous with civilization itself, the city whose destruction would have sent a shockwave through history that we would still be feeling today. And he left it alone. The question of why has been argued over for 15 centuries, and I want to walk you through every explanation that has been seriously proposed, because the truth is almost certainly a combination of all of them, and the specific combination tells us something essential about how Attila's mind worked. The explanation that medieval Christianity embraced most enthusiastically, and that became the dominant narrative for over 1,000 years, was divine intervention. Pope Leo I traveled north to meet Attila in person, somewhere near the river Mincio, and the meeting apparently produced the retreat. The Church's interpretation was straightforward. Leo's holiness, his moral authority, the visible hand of God operating through his representative on earth, caused the fearsome Attila to turn back in awe and reverence. Later artistic tradition depicted the scene with Saints Peter and Paul appearing in the sky above Leo, swords drawn, threatening Attila with divine punishment. It is a magnificent image. It is almost certainly not what happened. Attila was not a man who was moved by religious theater, and his track record of respecting ecclesiastical authority was not extensive. Something else drove the decision, and the Church's narrative, however beautiful, papers over it. The more prosaic explanations are more convincing precisely because they are more prosaic. Disease was ravaging the Hunnic army. Italy in the summer was a disease environment that steppe warriors had no immunity to. Malaria, in particular, was endemic to the Po Valley lowlands, and there are reasonable indications that the Hunnic forces were suffering significant attrition from illness rather than combat. Supply lines were a genuine crisis. The army had been stripping the territory it moved through, which works brilliantly as a short-term strategy and becomes catastrophic when you've been in the same operational theater long enough to exhaust the available resources. The Eastern Roman Empire, freed from its usual paralysis by the emergency, had sent forces across the Danube to raid Hunnic territory, while Attila's main army was committed in Italy. A classic two-front pressure that forced him to weigh the cost of continuing against the cost of leaving his home base exposed. These are real factors. They matter. They probably contributed to the decision. But I want to offer you a fourth explanation, one that gets less attention than it deserves because it requires crediting Attila with a kind of strategic restraint that does not fit the monster narrative. Consider this. Attila's entire operational model was built on extracting maximum value from the threat of destruction, rather than from destruction itself. The Eastern Empire had paid him rivers of gold precisely because Constantinople was intact and functioning. A destroyed Constantinople paid nothing. The Western Empire, similarly, was more valuable as a paying client than as a smoking ruin. There is a version of the retreat from Italy that looks less like failure and more like deliberate restraint. He had made his point, demonstrated that Italy was indefensible, extracted significant plunder from the north, and positioned himself to make demands that a terrified Valentinian would have enormous incentive to meet. Destroying Rome would end the game. Leaving Rome standing, scarred and trembling, kept the game going. And Attila, whatever else he was, understood the game. The meeting with Pope Leo fits into this framework in a way that does not require miracles. Leo came with gold, significant amounts of it, contributed by the Roman Church and the Italian aristocracy who had every reason to buy Attila's departure. He came with promises of future diplomatic accommodation. He came, possibly, with information about the Eastern Roman incursion into Hunnic territory that Attila already knew about, but that the meeting gave him a face-saving way to respond to. The retreat could be framed as magnanimous rather than strategic. Attila could leave Italy without appearing to flee it. The Pope got to go home with a story about divine intervention that would serve the Church's interests for centuries. Attila got what he actually came for, which was leverage, gold, and the demonstrated ability to walk into Italy any time he chose.
It was, in its way, a perfectly transactional outcome dressed in the clothing of a miracle. Here is what the retreat from Italy actually reveals about Attila, and why I think it is the most important moment in his entire story. Every other action in his career, the killing of his brother, the systematic bleeding of Constantinople, the invasion of Gaul, can be explained by straightforward logic of expansion and dominance. The retreat requires a different kind of explanation. It requires a man who could look at the most tempting target imaginable, within reach, essentially undefended, and choose not to take it, because taking it would damage the larger system he depended on. That is not the psychology of a conqueror drunk on his own momentum. That is the psychology of someone who is playing a longer game than anyone around him realizes. It makes him more frightening, not less. A man who can stop himself at the gates of Rome is a man who is in control of something most conquerors never manage to control: himself. And a man like that, still alive, still commanding the most feared military force in the world, with the debts of 2 empires still outstanding. What does he do next? What is the move that follows the strategic restraint, the calculated departure, the preserved leverage? We are about to find out. Except that history, with its particular sense of irony, had different plans entirely. In the early months of 453, Attila the Hun took another wife. This was not unusual. He had many wives, a domestic arrangement entirely consistent with Hunnic aristocratic custom, and the addition of a new one, named Ildiko, was a political and personal event of no particular external significance. There was a feast, as there always was. There was drinking, as there always was. His warriors and subordinates celebrated through the night in the great hall, while Attila retired with his new bride. And in the morning, when the doors of his chamber were finally opened because no one had seen him emerge, and the silence had stretched too long, they found him dead. Lying on his back in a pool of blood, no wound on his body, no enemy in the room, just Attila, who had remade the known world through sheer force of will, dead on his wedding night, from a nosebleed so severe that he had choked on his own blood in his sleep. The most feared man alive had been killed by his own body while he was drunk and unconscious. History has a vicious sense of irony. The immediate reaction across the Hunnic camp was a grief so extreme it reads almost like theater, except that it was entirely genuine. His warriors, according to the sources, cut their own faces with their blades so that the greatest of warriors would be mourned with blood rather than tears, that the weeping would be done in a language he would have respected. His body was displayed in a silken tent on the open plain, while his finest horsemen rode in circles around it, singing his deeds. Then he was buried in the night, in a secret location that has never been found, in a triple coffin of gold and silver and iron. Gold for the tribute of his enemies,
silver for his dominion, iron for his conquests. The men who dug the grave were killed afterward so that no one could reveal the location. Attila had controlled information as a weapon his entire life. He controlled it in death, too. But here is what matters more than the theatrical details of his funeral, more than the mystery of his burial site, more than the question of whether Il Dico had anything to do with his death, a theory that ancient sources raise and that historians have been politely skeptical of ever since. What matters is what happened the moment he was gone. The Hunnic Empire, that vast, terrifying, extraordinarily effective machine that had bled two Roman empires and reshaped the political geography of an entire continent, collapsed. Not gradually, not over decades of slow decline. It collapsed almost immediately, within a generation, with a speed that is genuinely shocking when you set it against the scale of what it had been. Within a year of Attila's death, his sons were at war with each other over the succession. Within 2 years, the Germanic peoples who had been held inside the Hunnic Confederation by a combination of loyalty, fear, and the demonstrated competence of a single dominant will rose in revolt. The Battle of Nidau in 454, barely a year after the wedding night, saw the subject peoples of the Hunnic Empire defeat Attila's sons and effectively end Hunnic military dominance in Europe. The empire did not outlive its creator by even 24 months. This is the fact that I want you to sit with, because it is the most revealing thing in the entire story. Attila had spent his whole career building something: an empire, a confederation, a system of power and terror and tribute that stretched across half a continent. He had been extraordinarily successful at building it. And yet, the thing he built was so completely dependent on his personal presence, his specific intelligence, his irreplaceable ability to hold incompatible forces together through sheer force of personality, that it could not survive a single night without him. He had not built an institution. He had built a projection of himself. And when the projector died, the image disappeared. The Roman Empire, for all its dysfunction and rot, had survived the deaths of terrible emperors and mediocre ones and genuinely insane ones for centuries, because it had something Attila never bothered to create: a system that was larger than any individual inside it. Attila was the system, and that was both his greatest achievement and his fatal architectural flaw. The Romans, to their credit, understood this immediately. The Eastern Emperor Marcian, who had replaced the tribute-paying Theodosius II and had already stopped the gold payments to Attila in 450, gambling correctly that Attila would be too committed to his Italian campaign to respond, must have experienced something close to disbelief at the news from across the Danube. The threat that had defined his empire's foreign policy for 2 decades was simply gone. Not defeated, not negotiated away, not gradually contained. Gone, overnight, because of a nosebleed. The Western Empire had less time to appreciate the development. Valentinian III was assassinated in 455, partly as a consequence of his execution of Aetius the previous year, a decision so catastrophically stupid that a contemporary observer reportedly told Valentinian that he had cut off his own right hand with his left. Without Aetius, without the man who had actually known how to manage the post-Attila chaos, the Western Empire accelerated its own disintegration and fell in 476. The removal of the Hunnic threat did not save it. The damage was already too deep. And here is the thread I want to pull on as we reach the end of this story, because it connects everything we have covered to something that is not safely confined to the 5th century. Attila's empire failed for a reason that has repeated itself throughout history with such consistency that it almost qualifies as a law. Power that is built entirely around a single exceptional individual is structurally indistinguishable from no power at all,
because it has exactly one point of failure. Alexander the Great's empire fragmented the moment he died, divided among his generals into warring successor states. Napoleon's empire evaporated so completely after his exile that within a generation it was almost as if it had never existed. The pattern is always the same. Extraordinary individual, extraordinary achievement. Zero institutional resilience, total collapse. The men who build empires on personal genius almost never build the one thing that would make those empires last. A system that does not need them.
What Attila did accomplish, and this is where the legacy gets genuinely complicated, was reshape the world in ways that outlasted him by centuries. The migration of peoples that the Hunnic expansion triggered, the cascade of Germanic tribes pushed westward into Roman territory by the Hunnic advance, fundamentally altered the ethnic and political composition of Europe. The Visigoths, who sacked Rome in 410, the Vandals, who sacked it again in 455, the Ostrogoths, who eventually displaced the last Western emperor. All of these movements were downstream consequences of Hunnic pressure. Attila did not destroy the Western Roman Empire directly. He destabilized the entire system so thoroughly that it could no longer absorb the shocks it had always managed before. He was not the disease. He was the fever that revealed how sick the patient already was. The distinction matters, and it is one that Roman writers, for obvious reasons, were not eager to make. So where does that leave us? Was Attila a monster? The cities he erased, the populations he killed or enslaved, the systematic use of terror as a primary tool, these things are not redeemable by strategic sophistication. They happened. The people they happened to were real. The suffering was real. There is no angle from which Naissus rebuilt itself, or the bones on the Balkan plains became something other than what they were. And yet the man who did these things was also operating with a clarity of strategic vision that most leaders across all of recorded history have never approached. He understood systems. He understood psychology. He understood the difference between what power looks like and what power actually is. He had been given, by his unusual biography, a view of the ancient world from both the inside and the outside simultaneously, and he used that view with a precision that his enemies never fully comprehended until it was too late.
What genuinely unsettles me about Attila, what keeps this story from being comfortably historical, from being safely located in the 5th century, where we can admire or condemn it from a distance, is how recognizable the mechanics are. The gap between institutional performance and institutional reality that he exploited in Rome exists in every large organization that has been running long enough to mistake its own traditions for competence. The use of fear as a substitute for legitimacy, the extraction of resources through demonstrated willingness to inflict consequences, the construction of personal authority so total that it cannot be delegated or transferred. None of these are 5th century inventions. They are permanent features of how power operates when it is held by someone who understands it deeply and is not particularly troubled by its costs. Attila did not invent anything. He just ran the oldest playbook in human history with an unusual degree of skill and an unusual degree of self-awareness. And the world he left behind, for better and worse, is still the one we are living in.